listening to CMDA Matters, the weekly podcast of Christian medical and dental associations. Here's your host, Dr. Mike Chupp.
Well, greetings once again in the new year, friends of CMDA Matters. I hope that you are back into the rhythms and routines of life in 2025, and that listening to this weekly podcast that we release every Thursday morning, it will be a vital part of your podcast listening diet, so to speak. We desperately desire for you to be educated, encouraged, and equipped to glorify God in your work, whatever that looks like at this stage of your journey in healthcare, or maybe as you're walking alongside a Christian healthcare professional. Here at CMDA, we're already looking forward with great anticipation to the ways that we trust God is going to work in and through this ministry, bringing the hope and healing of Christ to the world through healthcare professionals, those who love Him with all of their hearts and souls and minds and their strength until He takes us home. On this week's episode, Dr. Jeff Barrows and I, we had the opportunity to welcome Mary Eberstadt to the podcast. We got introduced to Mary through one of her recent books about the sexual revolution and spent several months reading and thinking and preparing to talk about that book for our interview today. If you're not familiar with Mary, she's a senior fellow at the Faith and Reason Institute, and she's the author of several influential books of nonfiction, including How the West Really Lost God. Another book, we're going to talk about it today, Adam and Eve After the Pill, and then one of her former works entitled Primal Screams, How the Sexual Revolution Created Identity Politics. We've been producing this weekly podcast, it's hard to believe, since 2020. So this month marks the beginning of our 6th year in bringing you CMDA Matters. And this subject matter, which focuses today on the sexual revolution, with the gender and identity crisis being a recent form thrust of this revolution, if you will, for you medical folks, continues to be a major topic that you, our listeners, want to hear from us. So I invite you to keep listening as we talk with Mary Eberstadt. Well, today on CMDA Matters, Dr. Jeff Barrows and I, we were introduced to an author and a social critic by a past president of the Catholic Medical Association, Dr. Steve White, a couple of years ago, and to a book that she has written. In fact, she wrote it back in 2012 and wrote an update last year entitled Adam and Eve After the Pill, Paradoxes of the Sexual Revolution. And when Dr. Steve White, this pulmonologist, told us about Mary, her name rung a bell. And I went to my Kindle library, and there was It's Dangerous to Believe from 2016, Religious Freedom and Its Enemies, written by Mary Eberstadt. So Mary is Senior Fellow at the Faith and Reason Institute and author of several influential books of nonfiction, including How the West Really Lost God. And as I mentioned, Adam and Eve After the Pill, as well as another book related to the sexual revolution, Primal Screams, How the Sexual Revolution Created Identity Politics. But her very first work was entitled The Loser Letters in 2010 that became a play. So, Mary, I'm very interested in these. I was told there's somehow a relationship to the Screw Tape Letters by C.S. Lewis. Welcome to the program, and tell us about the Loser Letters, first of all.
Oh, thank you, Mike and Jeff. Thanks for having me. So The Loser Letters is a work of fiction. It was published in 2010 at the height of the new atheism. If you remember back then, there were several bestsellers by Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and others making the case for atheism. And there was pushback against that from believers, of course. But rather than take this phenomenon seriously, I thought it would be more interesting to make a little fun of it. So The Loser Letters is a satire. It's about a young woman in rehab who is infatuated with atheism. And in the course of the book, her own story comes out, and you realize why she is infatuated, what has happened in her life that has made her turn away from religious belief. So That was a wonderful adventure, and seeing the play on stage was one of the greatest thrills ever. And I'd love to do more of that kind of work when we don't have to be quite so serious about things.
Well, Mary, Dr. Steve White sent us each a copy of this book. He wanted us to read this. And my daughters have seen it on my end table where I've been reading it over the last 3 or 4 months and keep saying, "What have you learned about the pill?" And I said, well, actually, it's really a focus on the sexual revolution as much as it is about the pill. But tell our listeners, Mary, how has the sexual revolution fulfilled its promises of greater personal freedom, equality, and happiness? And in what ways has it fallen short?
Let me just give a little bit of background about how I got interested in this subject. I have been a writer and researcher for some time, and I want to tell listeners that one thing they should know about the book is that you don't have to have theology to understand it. This is not a theological or religious book. It is rather an assembling of social science that I believe makes the case that the sexual revolution has been a net loss for humanity. So, what is in the positive column? Well, if you go back to the 1960s and you read what was said about the pill and the benefits it would bring, you could see that people were really excited back then. They thought that it would strengthen marriage if couples had control over their fertility in this way. And they thought that it would reduce the abortion rate. That was another promise that goes all the way back to Margaret Sanger and her case for contraception. She said it would reduce abortion. And it would, of course, free up women to join the paid marketplace in numbers that they had never joined it before. Now, that part of it is true. The fact that so many women now don't have pregnancies at all means that they can be in the paid workforce throughout their earning life. And many people would say that that's a good thing. But on the other side of the ledger, there are things we have to look at that nobody in the 1960s was thinking about. Things like what it means when people don't have children. What is the relationship between that and loneliness? Things like what's the relationship between contraception and abortion, really? Because instead of the promise that contraception would reduce abortion, what we saw were skyrocketing rates of it in every country in the Western world after the adoption of contraception. So these are the kind of issues that my book takes up and again concludes after looking at them, I think, pretty thoroughly, that the sexual revolution was not a liberation for humanity. It has actually turned out to be a step backward for many people.
Well, Mary, with that introduction, let's maybe take a little bit deeper dive into the impact of the sexual revolution on the stability of institutions within our culture, like marriage and family.
Right. So the idea that contraception would be good for marriage was, again, very widely accepted when all of this got started. But instead, what happened were skyrocketing rates of divorce, for example, one of the first effects of the mass adoption of contraception. Obviously, that wasn't good for the family, but why did it happen? In the book, I cite perfectly secular economists who can explain that what the pill did essentially was to flood the sexual marketplace with potential partners. And what that did was reduce the incentives for men, especially, to settle down with any one of them. So once again, instead of strengthening marriage and family, contraception destabilized it, destabilized both institutions. And once more, you don't need religion to show you this. I'm not using religion in any way. And the reason that I stress that is that many people think of contraception and the sexual revolution as religious subjects somehow, because, of course, religious institutions have opinions about these things. But I'm taking a different approach here. I'm saying let's look at the perfectly secular evidence. Let's look at things like, for example, adolescent and childhood psychiatric trouble. This is something that I've been tracking throughout my writing career because I think it's one of the flashing signs out there that our civilization has run amok. Why are kids showing higher rates of anxiety and depression than they used to? And this is something that was true before the pandemic when we saw these things spike. Way before that, decades before that, there was a rise in troubled behavior, troubled thoughts, anxiety, depression, and other psychiatric problems among young people. Well, when you get into the weeds of the social science, you see that these things correlate, among other things, with the disrupted home. And some people would say, well, that's just common sense. Of course, kids are going to be more stable in a stable home with two biological parents, if possible. But you don't need common sense to get there. You can read the studies establishing the connections between stability at home and outcomes for kids. So once again, we have here a phenomenon that is traceable directly to the sexual revolution, that is, the broken hearth, and consequences that include bad outcomes for kids. That, I think, is a very important place to look when we weigh the positives and the negatives of what happened after the 1960s.
Well, Mary, Dr. Barrows and I joined a group of almost 80 physicians on the steps of the Supreme Court, and we were there for the oral arguments for the Dobbs case. And it was 6 or 7 months later that the decision was handed down in June of 2022. So since that time, you've released an update, Adam and Eve After the Pill Revisited. Did the Dobbs case have something to do with that? And then what did you do in that update called Revisited?
So the update, Mike, is actually a whole new book. The first book, the first Adam and Eve book, looked at what I call the microscopic effects of the sexual revolution, the effects on men, women, children, families, etc. The second book is a summary of about 10 years of research since then, looking at wider effects. What has the revolution done to society, to our politics, and to Christianity itself? So there's a book 1 and a book 2 there. And book 2, like book 1, reaches the conclusion that this radical new way of living that was adopted in the 1960s is having profound effects on the way our society organizes itself. And it is also having profound effects on the churches.
Well, Mary, as we all know, younger generations tend to push back against what's happening in their prior generation. So I'm curious as to your thoughts. How are current younger generations challenging or reinforcing the outcomes of the sexual revolution, and how are they doing that?
Well, I think we're seeing a lot of pushback. Some of it is subtle and some of it isn't by the Zoomers and millennials. For example, there is the whole question of the chemical effects of chemical birth control. What does it do to the body? And when I get questions about that, I duck them because I am not a real doctor. Unlike you guys, I would defer to medical doctors to explain those effects. But definitely the pill itself, qua pill, is more out of fashion than it used to be. And in one of the books, I cite examples from popular culture, I believe Vogue magazine, for example, and other places where young people talk among themselves. If you look at those places, you'll find a real skepticism that goes along with this greater concern for the environment generally. So that's one form of pushback that we see from the young. But I think there are more moving indicators that they are aware something has gone wrong. In the first Adam and Eve book, I have a whole chapter about popular music from the 90s onward. And the reason is that I started listening to it when I had kids who were of an age to listen to that stuff. And I started listening in particular to rap music and to Eminem. And the result is a 7,000 word chapter about the themes of popular music in America during those years. Because the kind of liberation that one sees in early rock and roll is absolutely missing by the time you get to the 1990s. What are those singers and rappers talking about? They are talking about how hard it is to live without a dad at home. They're talking about being abandoned. They're talking about their dysfunctional families. They're talking about what it's like to have to take care of a younger sibling. And they're angry. And again, Eminem, this towering figure in popular music, is paradigmatic for this reason. These are his themes. The themes are not how wonderful life is after the sexual revolution. The themes are not the themes that were showing up among the hippies and early rock and roll. The themes are instead about living with the fallout of a world in which some half of American kids are growing up without their biological parents at home at some point in their lives. That, I think, is very telling testimony, Mike. And it isn't only Eminem. In that chapter, which is in the first Adam and Eve book, I also cite other examples of many other popular bands making this same case. So again, here we have another example of a kind of proof that is emanating upward, that there's something about the way people are living in the post-revolutionary world that is harming the young.
We've seen a number of op-eds in some major newspapers, New York Times, Washington Post, regarding how especially women have written articles about how, maybe this whole idea that we had about sex, that it was just about consent, maybe that's not enough. And I can't remember the names of the various op-ed authors, but especially since your most recent book, Revisited, how do you see that relationships have continued to evolve between men and women out there in our society in the U.S. today?
Well, I'm not the first person to observe that there's a lot of sadness and confusion out there. And the question is, where is it coming from? Everyone I know, just to speak anecdotally, who knows young women under the age of 35, will tell you that there are a lot of amazing young women and that the men are in the basement playing video games at best. In other words, what is going on with this inability to make a commitment to another person? I think what's going on is that our world has become so destabilized that young people haven't seen enough examples of commitment in action to want to go there. Similarly, what's going on with the fact that so many fewer people are having children? Again, many are not seeing role models of what it is to be a mother, what it is to be a father, what it is to take care of a child. There's a kind of social knowledge, basic social knowledge that has been reduced by the way we have come to live post-revolution. What do I mean by that? I mean common sense things. What was the net effect of all this contraception and family disruption? The net effect has been to reduce the number of people in other people's lives. People have been subtracted out of other people's lives, especially the young, by abortion, by contraception, by family breakup. And the result is that people are not learning from large extended family networks the way they used to. Notice what I'm saying here. I'm not glorifying the nuclear family. I think it was always a mistake to glorify the nuclear family at the expense of the extended family, because that's what I'm talking about. People today have many fewer sisters, brothers, aunts, uncles, cousins, etc. And this might seem like a benign change unless you stop to wonder, what does it take to be successful in life? Well, one thing it takes is having loving people in your life who love you unconditionally. That would be your family. Does it matter if there's one person in that unit as opposed to scores? It would seem to. Mm-hmm. So again, I think part of what we're seeing in the disrupted romances of so many young people, or the inability to even acquire that, is that there's a real diminution of knowledge out there about the opposite sex, about marriage itself, about parenthood itself. And I think this is what's showing up in the uncertainty we see in those statistics on low marriage rates, low childbearing rates, etc.
Before we continue with this week's episode, here's a special announcement for you. If you haven't yet visited the CMDA Learning Center, then you are missing out. Our Learning Center is filled with continuing education courses to help you learn about today's bioethical issues. More than 100 hours of credits are available at no cost to CMDA members, and we're adding new courses on a regular basis. Designed to advance your knowledge in key areas of healthcare today, our educational content is a trusted source of education for thousands of healthcare professionals. And it's free for CMDA members. Get started today by visiting the Learning Center at cmda.org/learning. We're excited to announce the newest addition to CMDA's long list of resources for our members, and it is specifically for students and residents. Called Standing Strong in Training, this new curriculum helps healthcare students and residents stand up against the cultural pressures facing Christians within healthcare today. The curriculum's 7 modules are designed for group settings, allowing attendees to solidify their foundational worldview beliefs regarding important issues, such as the beginning of life, end of life, and biblical sexuality. Each module also offers ideas of how to winsomely defend biblical values and positively interact with others in developing their worldview beliefs. For more information and to download this free resource, visit cmda.org/standingstrong. Let's jump right back into this week's episode.
Well, Mary, even though you have said that you use social science as your backup in terms of, or your argument as to what your premises are in the book, I'm curious as to what you feel about the impact that the sexual revolution has had in terms of individuals' relationships with faith and moral traditions.
Yes, that is what my book, How the West Really Lost God, is about. Because when people think about secularization and declining church membership, they often assume that these things happened because of prosperity, for example, that we got too rich and happy to need God anymore. Or they assume that religion is something the lower classes are doing and everyone else is free of it. In the book, How the West Really Lost God, I march through these common ideas and show that they do not explain religious decline. Instead, I think religious decline is coming from somewhere else, which is, again, the imploding family unit. Let's just take a practical example. In cases of divorce, for instance, at least in the United States, parents often end up with shared custody, where a child goes to one on this weekend and one on that weekend. That disrupts religious education, right? That's just a very homely example. But it's also the case that in a world where everything feels impermanent, I think it is harder for people to grasp the idea of eternity itself, of God himself, because they have more and more lost a firm footing in their families. The fate of the churches and the fate of the family, I think, are very tightly bound up. And that is what How the West Really Lost God is about.
Well, Mary, there are a number of things that you would wish that we could reverse. And in at least one of your, but maybe both of your books, you talk about the genie out of the bottle, specifically of pornography. You have two chapters in a row in your first book, which are quite interesting, and that is food and sex and tobacco and pornography. You point out that there was a very pivotal event that took place regarding tobacco, and that was the release, I believe, of C. Everett Koop, the Surgeon General's report about the impact of smoking on our health. More recently, Vivek Murthy, the Surgeon General, has put out on the impact, the harms of social media. And I don't know if it's directly related, but it seems like a lot of things have happened since his release, and people thinking about maybe we shouldn't be allowing our children on social media. And I've heard recently Australia just passed in the last week or so some pretty stringent laws about children and social media. So my question would be this: do we need something like a Surgeon General announcement for the Surgeon General or some other leader to be convinced of the harms of pornography so that we can start getting this genie back in the bottle, so to speak?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mike. So the example of tobacco and the example of social media go to show that we are capable of renorming ourselves, right? Mm-hmm. There really is no such thing as some inevitable arc of history. We learn from past mistakes, and that's a positive thing. So in the case of tobacco, it took a long time and a very long-running public relations battle, but finally a kind of critical mass of people were convinced that smoking was bad and decided to put more and more parameters around it. And as you mentioned, this is just beginning to happen with social media. So why has pornography so far been exempt? I don't think it should be. It is ubiquitous. It's on smartphones. It's potentially right there for everybody who wants it. And yet there is evidence there, too, that this is not some victimless situation. Pornography is damaging society. How do we know this? Well, we know this because it is frequently cited as a cause for divorce, for example. We know this because there are more and more therapists who are feeling the need to treat this as an addiction, which is proof, again, of harm. And we know this because there are more and more products designed to protect us from having to see this, things that we can put on our laptops, put on our phones. So I am optimistic that in time we will see the same kind of opprobrium extended to pornography consumption that we saw extended to tobacco consumption. And we will be better off for it.
Well, Mary, then that leads into my next question. How would you envision the church in a capacity to lead the way towards not just returning our Western society to traditional views, but even leading the way in making it clear that pornography is harmful, and just like tobacco is harmful? How could the church lead the way in that process?
I think there is a vindication here that Christians don't understand for Christian teaching. Because ever since the invention of the internet, almost no one in public has had a problem with the amount of pornography out there except the churches. That is to say, after a couple of decades of accumulating harm brought on by pornography use, the churches can point to that and say, see, we were onto something. Christianity is onto something in these relatively strict rules that we have surrounding matters of sex. That's vindication. That's something the churches should be proud of. And I hear very little of it. I hear very little awareness that Christian teaching is being vindicated by what's happening in our world. But that is a truth that I think should be shouted from the pulpits, and not in a triumphalist way. We're not exactly in a triumphalist moment for religion. But it is still the case that there's more vindication out there every day when we look at what it means to live without, say, the good book. So these are messages that pastors can put out there. I think also it would be great to have pastors challenging the young in particular, who I think sense that something's really wrong out there. Challenge them to live up to these teachings. I'll tell you an anecdote. from another podcast. The host was talking to me off the air about how his real job is running a restaurant. And he said, I had several young men in the restaurant one day, and we were just, goofing around. And I said, hey guys, I have an idea. Why don't you make a pledge that for 4 weeks you won't look at pornography on your phones? This I thought was pretty bold, but my interlocutor was a Christian man in a position to influence the young people who worked for him. So they took it as a dare and came back 4 weeks later, proud of themselves, saying that they had done this thing, and he rewarded them somehow. But that's not just a story for one restaurant owner. I think the kind of attitude we see there of challenging people to be better than the seaweed around them, challenging them to be proud of themselves for trying to live up to principles and moral teachings, I think that's something we could see a lot more of.
Well, Mary, certainly CMDA is a Protestant Evangelical Membership Association of Healthcare Professionals, and you are a practicing, teaching Roman Catholic. And at the conclusion of your first book, you spent actually a fair amount of time talking about the vindication of Humanae Vitae from Pope Paul VI. And I mean, I was only 5 years old when this was released. I have to say that I learned a lot by just reading this chapter. But could you just summarize? It's been almost 60 years since that release of that declaration by the Pope. And there's a predominant, there's just an amazing amount of information. And you point out in the book, it's not by people devoted to the Catholic faith who are pointing this out, that these predictions have basically all come true. Can you unpack that just briefly for our listeners?
Yes, sure. So that encyclical Humanae Vitae on human life was probably the most reviled document of the 20th century. It's funny because people don't realize that the church wasn't doing something new. It was, in fact, reasserting longstanding teaching that went back to the earliest days of the church against contraception. Now, we all know the Christians were against that. They were also against a lot of other things that the Romans took for granted, like bestiality and infanticide, etc. So Humanae Vitae was meant to be a reiteration of those 2 millennia of teaching on the subject. But in a world that had just embraced the sexual revolution and was, in effect, having a great big party, it was very unwelcome to have that restatement. So it's all the more remarkable to consider the predictions that the document made. It predicted that in a world after the sexual revolution, although it didn't use that phrase, but in a world where contraception was normalized, there would be a lessening of respect for women by men. And I think we could use all kinds of proofs to establish that that prediction came true. It predicted that some governments would use these technologies coercively and against the will of their people. And it made that prediction long before China's barbaric one-child policy, which did exactly that, and also before the Indian government's coercive use of technologies and the coercive use of those technologies, even by some American judges, forcing Norplant, long-acting contraceptive, on certain women convicted of crimes. So that was another prediction that came true. And the question is, why is there so much truth in that document if the doctrine it was upholding was wrong? That's a very explosive question these days, I know. But it looks in retrospect as if this document that was so controversial and unwanted, including, and I think especially among Catholics, since nobody else had to pay attention to it, but it was Catholics who revolted against all of this. Why was that document that was so reviled at the same time so prophetic? And that's why I wrote that chapter. In the second book, I give an update on that. I go to new source material in the 10 years between the books to make a similar case about the prophetic power of that encyclical.
Well, Mary, I want to thank you for joining us today on CMDA Matters. We have run out of time. Jeff, anything else you wanted to ask?
Well, as an OBGYN, I would encourage our listeners that are prescribing the pill, and I did that for decades, I would encourage them to get this book, read it. It will cause them to think a little bit more deeply about just the simple prescribing of the pill, and even though it may not necessarily make them stop it, but perhaps think a little more deeply about the impact they're having.
Yeah. I don't think it's just maybe the Zoomers, as you called them, and the millennials who are calling to question what the results of the pill are. But again, even my own daughters, I've seen Protestant young evangelicals who've been wondering if they really want to follow in our generation's example in the use of the pill, and going back to more following cycles and rhythm method, more the traditional view that the church has taken over the centuries. So thank you for both of these versions, both the 2012 and 2023. And I think part of the book that I want to go back is your more recent book, and the whole idea that secularism, and it's a faith, it is a strong faith, whether or not they're willing to admit it, that secularism has its sacraments, specifically abortion as its sacrament.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the wonderful conversation. I'd also like to add that the chapter I was talking about on popular music is actually pretty condensed within the book. So if listeners are interested, they can find it online under the title Eminem is Right, and find that argument made at length that what we are seeing in popular music is showing us something that's gone wrong about our society.
Something tells me, listeners, that if you pay attention to public discourse or First Things or any other writings out there, blogs that are about the sexual revolution, you're going to find Mary Eberstadt's name in the future. So we'll keep our eyes and ears open, Mary. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Mike and Jeff. I enjoyed it very much.
Well, I mentioned during the interview that the first book of Mary's that I read had the title, It is Dangerous to Believe, Religious Freedom and Its Enemies. And that reminded me of two special guest speakers that we will have in our upcoming National Convention, May 1st through the 4th in St. Charles, Missouri. The first one is former Ambassador for Religious Freedom and past Governor of Kansas, Ambassador Sam Brownback. We were so inspired by Ambassador Brownback as he gave the keynote address for our celebration 2 years ago at the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C., in which we launched the Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine. And Ambassador Brownback is scheduled to give our opening Thursday evening talk. And then on Friday, we will be honoring a Finnish pediatrician, Dr. Päivi Räsänen, with our President's Heritage Award. Dr. Räsänen became a parliamentarian in Finland over 2 decades ago and has been a guest on CMDA Matters twice because she was targeted in the infamous so-called Bible tweet by a Finnish prosecutor, and she's been taken to the Supreme Court of Finland because of her terrible offense of not just believing that God's word is true, but also sharing her views and her church's traditional views based on Scripture on social media that marriage is between one man and one woman. Päivi is inspiring Christians in Finland and around the world with her courage, so I want to encourage you to get registered and join us May 1st through the 4th in St. Charles, Missouri for our annual national convention. You can find out more info and register by going to natcon.cmda.org today. I also want to encourage you to check out Mary Eberstadt's books, which you can find in the online CMDA bookstore, and that is located within christianbook.com. You'll find books like Adam and Eve After the Pill, The Loser Letters, and more from Mary. And if you'd like to learn more about the Faith and Reason Institute, please visit frinstitute.org. And of course, we have included that link in our show notes today. Are you ready to step into 2025 with clarity and purpose? CMDA Coaching has a series of exciting and transformative events to help you do just that. The first is a free informal session, which will be held January 19th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, titled, "What Am I Doing?" and Other Important Questions to Ask Myself. Our certified coaching team will guide you through storytelling and discussion, exploring key questions to help you enter your new year with renewed focus and direction. The second is for those who are interested in becoming a certified coach or enhancing your leadership skills, and that's our 501 Foundations for Coaching course. These two options, which include a 6-week course that runs January 28th through March 4th, or a 2-day course on April 4th and 5th, they're filling up fast, friends. So register today to secure your spot. And the last course from our CMDA coaching team, one that I actually am personally signed up for and I'm very excited about, is called Mentoring with a Coach Approach, being led by Dr. Darylyn Falk and Pastor Ken Jones. Starting February 6th, this 4-week course meets each Tuesday evening. It'll teach you how to mentor with a coaching mindset, empowering you with coaching techniques for effective mentoring. Limited spots are available. I've got one of them. So visit cmda.org/coaching for more information and to register. By the way, there is still time to register for a webinar that we're hosting this Saturday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time with our friends at the Hendricks Center at Dallas Theological Seminary. It's the latest in our series that we call The Convergence, Critical Conversations for Healthcare and Theology. Now that we're past last November's national elections, please join us for this critical conversation as we discuss what we learned through this year's election cycle. Our guest speakers will be Dr. Darrell Bach of Dallas Theological Seminary, Dr. Jeff Barrows, our Vice President of Advocacy and Bioethics here at CMDA, and Nicole Hayes, who is our Director of State Public Policy at CMDA. During this webinar, we will explore the practical implications for God's church in today's cultural and political environment from both theological and medical perspectives. To register, you can just visit cmda.org/events and look for those details. You are highly welcome to join me next Thursday when Dr. Barrows and we will be joined by Dr. Michael Laidlaw. He is a board-certified endocrinologist who has spoken out, written about, and served as an expert witness for sensible legislation to stop the use of harmful hormones, puberty blockers, and surgeries provided to minors for the purpose of gender transition of those minors. He's an expert on the side effects and consequences of cross-sex hormones in kids. So please join us. As I close, I want to share a testimony we received at the end of the year from a CMDA student leader who said, quote, "CMDA has served as an anchor for my faith. CMDA not only reminded me of the reason I went into medicine in the first place, but it was also the bridge between my faith and medicine. It provided the practical aspect of living a Jesus-filled life." Friends, testimonies like this one remind us why we continue to have these conversations, like today's chat with Mary Eberstadt, and why we continue to engage on topics like the sexual revolution or pornography, gender identity, and others. These conversations educate and equip healthcare students and professionals to live a Jesus-filled life as they seek to connect their faith with their profession. And in doing so, CMDA can help you and the healthcare professionals in your sphere of influence bring the hope and the healing of Christ to the world. That's what matters to CMDA, friends, in 2025. And CMDA matters. We'll see you next week, friends, with Dr. Michael Laidlaw, God willing.
Thanks for listening to CMDA Matters. If you would like to suggest a future guest or share a comment with us, please email cmdamatters@cmda.org. And if you like the podcast, be sure to give us a 5-star rating and share it on your favorite social media platform. This podcast has been a production of Christian Medical and Dental Associations. The opinions expressed by guests on this podcast are not necessarily endorsed by Christian Medical and Dental Associations. CMDA is a nonpartisan organization that does not endorse political parties or candidates for public office. The views expressed on this podcast reflect judgments regarding principles and values held by CMDA and its members and are not intended to imply endorsement of any political party or candidate.